The town of Blackwater had always carried a hush about it, the kind of quiet that clung to cobblestones and seeped into the marrow of its people. Nestled deep between the river's bend and the sprawling woods, it was the sort of place where stories lived longer than the people who told them. And no story was told more often, though in whispers, always in whispers, than the one about Margaret Hensley. Margaret had died 30 years ago, but her presence lingered as though her body had refused to accept the grave's embrace. She had been a schoolteacher, stern but fair, known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. The children feared her discipline, but they respected her honesty. Adults, however, especially men of power in Blackwater, resented her. She had spoken too freely of things better left unsaid, exposing lies, corruption, and betrayals that many wished forgotten. When she died suddenly one autumn night, her heart giving out, there were those in town who breathed easier. Her funeral was quick, perfunctory. They buried her in Blackwater Cemetery under an oak tree that leaned like an old man over her stone. But strange things began almost at once. The church bell tolled by itself on still nights. Her house windows opened, though they had been nailed shut. And people who had crossed her, people who had mocked her, people who had benefited from her silence started dying. Not in obvious ways, not in accidents that could be shrugged off, but in manners that bore Margaret's signature. A crooked banker who had stolen funds was found suffocated, his lungs packed with soil, as though the earth had climbed inside him. A councilman who had forced families off their land drowned in a bathtub, though the water barely covered his knees. As the years stretched on, the deaths slowed but never ceased. Every decade or so, someone with old blood ties to those men would vanish, leaving only whispers behind. Blackwater became a place where grudges outlived generations, where the dead seemed unwilling to let go. By the time Sarah Vance returned to town, she knew the story only as a bedtime tale her grandmother used to tell, warning her that the grave remembers, child, and so must you. Sarah hadn't believed it. She was a journalist, grounded in evidence and logic. But when her father, one of Blackwater's most respected judges, was found dead in his study, a quill pen driven through his throat, she felt the cold pull of something she could no longer ignore. Her investigation began as all investigations do, notes, interviews, piecing together timelines. But the deeper she went, the more the story warped around her. Old townsfolk would not meet her eyes. The archives at City Hall bore scorch marks, as though papers had burned from the inside. And in the cemetery, when she stood at Margaret's grave, she swore she heard the scrape of fingernails against the coffin lid. Night after night, her dreams filled with Margaret's voice. Not words exactly, but impressions, anger, betrayal, the sense of something stolen and never returned. She awoke each morning with dirt under her nails and the taste of river water on her tongue. She tried to reason it away, but Blackwater was not a place for reason. The breakthrough came when she discovered her father's old case files, locked in a desk drawer only she had the key to. Among them was a case buried decades earlier, Margaret Hensley's will. It had been contested, overturned in court by a panel of men, including her father's own father, that had stripped her estate and fortune from her surviving kin. The wealth had been absorbed by the town's elite, the same men who had prospered while Margaret's descendants disappeared into obscurity. Sarah realized then that Margaret was not lashing out blindly from the grave. She was speaking, demanding justice, her vengeance not random but deliberate, carried along the bloodline of betrayal. Every act, every death had been a message. The final night came with rain that hammered against the roof and lightning that split the sky into jagged seams. Sarah sat alone in her father's study, the will spread before her. She spoke aloud to the silence, her voice trembling but firm. "I hear you," she said. "I will tell your story. I will give back what was taken." The house groaned, the storm rattling its bones, but in that moment, the air seemed to settle. The presence that had haunted her dreams softened, retreating like a shadow drawn back into the earth. Sarah understood then. Margaret's revenge was not about the killings, not about terror. It was about memory. The dead speak when the living try to erase them. The next morning, Sarah left Blackwater with her father's files and Margaret's story burning inside her. She knew what she would write. She knew the world would finally hear the truth that had been buried under decades of silence. And though the town still whispered, though the oak still bent over Margaret's grave, the earth no longer stirred at night. But Blackwater had learned one thing too late: graves are not the end. They are only the places where the forgotten wait, and sometimes, if the wrongs are deep enough, the dead will not rest until their voices are heard. Sarah didn't leave Blackwater immediately. Something pulled at her, as if Margaret herself had placed a hand on her shoulder, holding her fast. Nights grew heavier with whispers. The wind that rattled her windows sometimes carried a woman's low hum, a lullaby that frayed into something more jagged, something like weeping. The graveyard became an obsession. She returned there often, as if the oak tree itself bent to invite her back. The ground around Margaret's stone looked different from the others. Damp, sunken, as though the earth had been disturbed more recently than 30 years ago. Once, in the pale wash of moonlight, Sarah saw something shift beneath the soil, a ripple, a bulge that rose and fell, as though the coffin below still breathed. She told herself she imagined it, but the next morning, when she returned in daylight, she found claw marks in the dirt. They hadn't been there before. Sarah began to dream more vividly. Margaret appeared to her fully now, not just as impressions. She was a tall figure, draped in a black dress that shimmered like wet stone, her eyes burning with a hunger that could not be sated. She never spoke with her mouth, but her voice filled the room all the same, reverberating through Sarah's skull. "They buried me with lies. Will you dig them out?" The question repeated, over and over, until Sarah woke with her bedsheets tangled around her like shrouds. Sometimes she woke choking on earth, coughing up black clods of soil that dissolved into dust before her eyes. She confided in no one. By now, her family had either fled town or lay in the ground, claimed by the curse. She was alone, the last Vance left in Blackwater. Perhaps that was why Margaret lingered, because Sarah was both the crime's heir and its only witness. When the town's autumn festival arrived, Sarah walked through the square as though among ghosts. She saw Margaret everywhere, in the corners of her eyes, in the shadows that stretched too far. The laughter of children twisted into Margaret's voice, reminding Sarah of debts unpaid. That night, the festival ended in screams. A fire erupted in the mayor's house, an inferno that seemed to leap faster than flames should. Witnesses swore they saw a woman standing in the blaze, her outline unmoving even as the timbers fell around her. The mayor's lineage traced back to one of the men who had profited from Margaret's lost will. By dawn, his body was found not burned, but buried alive in a shallow pit beside the oak tree, his fingernails torn down to the quick. Sarah knew then, Margaret's hunger was not finished. Vengeance fed on itself, and each act only sharpened the dead woman's thirst. Desperation pushed Sarah deeper into the archives, where she uncovered the part no one had ever spoken aloud. Margaret had not simply died of a weak heart. Her death had been arranged. The town doctor, bribed by the same men who stole her estate, had poisoned her medicine. He had sealed her fate with a signature on a death certificate, neat and unquestioned. Margaret had gone to her grave with a scream lodged in her throat, never given the chance to curse them with her living voice. Now, she cursed them from beneath the earth. Sarah realized she had only two choices: flee and let Margaret's wrath consume whatever blood remained in Blackwater, or confront the spirit and risk being the final link in the chain. On the 30th anniversary of Margaret's death, Sarah stood in the cemetery under a sky swollen with storm clouds. She carried a lantern and the will she had found. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out, reading Margaret's last testimony aloud to the restless dark. "I return to you what was taken," she said, her breath frosting in the air. "Your land, your name, your truth." The ground shuddered. The oak groaned as though in pain. From beneath the soil came the sound of fingernails again, only louder this time, furious, demanding. Sarah's lantern flickered, shadows writhing like living things. Then Margaret rose. Not in flesh, not in bone, but in something worse, an outline of her form, filled with black earth and crawling roots, her face a hollow mask that gaped wider and wider. Her voice thundered, not inside Sarah's head but in the air itself. Too late. The storm broke. Rain lashed, wind howled, and Margaret's shadow lunged toward Sarah. The will in Sarah's hands burst into flame, though no fire touched it. She dropped it, screamed, and fell backward into the mud. But instead of striking her, Margaret's figure halted. The shadow loomed, twisted, then collapsed back into the grave with a shriek that rattled every window in town. The oak split down the middle, lightning scorching it black. And silence followed. Sarah crawled away, gasping, drenched in rain and terror. She didn't know whether she had freed Margaret or only postponed her hunger. But one truth burned inside her. The dead do not rest when the living bury the truth. And in Blackwater, the grave was never just a grave. Sarah thought it was over that night in the cemetery, when Margaret's form collapsed into the grave and the oak split open like a wound. But the days that followed proved otherwise.
The town changed.
Blackwater had always been quiet, but now the silence felt swollen, suffocating. People avoided the square, avoided each other. Curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. Dogs barked at nothing, and then whimpered themselves hoarse. Sarah walked the streets and felt eyes on her, eyes that did not belong to the living. Shadows bent toward her, stretching long fingers across the cobblestones. In her room at the inn, mirrors warped her reflection. Sometimes she saw her own face, pale and wide-eyed. Other times she saw Margaret's, half-rotted, soil crumbling from her hollow cheeks. At night, the whispers began again. Louder now, impossible to ignore. They came not only from Margaret but from others, the banker who suffocated, the councilman who drowned, the mayor who clawed himself bloody in the dirt. Their voices layered together, rising like a tide inside her skull. We are not finished. We are not finished. We are not finished. Sleep abandoned her. When she tried, her body jerked awake to the sensation of hands dragging her into the mattress, pulling her down into darkness. One morning she woke with bruises around her wrists in the shape of fingers. Another, she woke with dirt packed under her eyelids, so gritty it burned when she blinked. Sarah began to question if she was alive at all. Blackwater no longer felt like a town, it felt like a mausoleum. Perhaps she had died with her father, with the rest of her family, and this was her punishment, to walk in the in-between, never free, never at rest. Driven half-mad, she returned to the cemetery once more. The oak was gone now, split and burned to a husk. Margaret's grave lay open, soil churned as though something had clawed its way out. The coffin was shattered. Inside, no body remained. Only scraps of black fabric and fingernails embedded in the wood. Sarah fell to her knees, trembling. The air stank of rot. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking into the empty sky. The answer came not from the ground but from behind her. Margaret stood at the edge of the graveyard path, her form clearer than ever before. No longer shadow but flesh stitched together with soil, worms writhing where veins should be. Her mouth split into a grotesque smile, her eyes glinting with something more than rage, something like triumph. "You," she said. The voice was no longer inside Sarah's head but in the air, sharp and real. Blood calls for blood. Sarah stumbled back. "I've done nothing. It wasn't me." Margaret's smile widened. "It was always you. Their blood runs in you. Their theft feeds your life. You are the last dead." The ground quaked. Gravestones cracked, splitting down their centers. From the soil, skeletal hands thrust upward, men, women, children long buried, all rising in twisted forms of flesh and bone. Their sockets glowed with dim light, their jaws unhinged in silent screams. Sarah ran, the cemetery erupting around her, the dead clawing their way free. She tripped, stumbled, felt icy fingers clutch at her ankles. She kicked, tore herself loose, and fled into the forest beyond. But Blackwater was no escape. Every path curved back toward the graveyard. Every tree seemed to lean, their branches knitting into a cage above her. She realized with mounting horror that there was nowhere to go. The town, the woods, even the sky had become Margaret's. By dawn, Sarah was found. Not alive, not dead. The innkeeper discovered her on the church steps, eyes wide, lips moving in constant whispers. She muttered Margaret's name over and over, fingernails bloody as though she'd been clawing at her own skin. The doctor declared her mad. She was locked in the asylum on the hill, where she still sits to this day. Some nights, passers-by swear they hear her voice carried on the wind, speaking not to herself, but to someone unseen. And in the graveyard, where the oak once stood, the ground never grew grass again. It remained black and wet, as though always freshly dug. The people of Blackwater learned at last what the elders had whispered all along. The dead do not forgive. The dead do not forget. And when they speak, the living have no choice but to listen.